Welcome back to part 3 of the project tutorial. So in this part, we're keeping working throughout this exercise of trying to sketch out a high-level implementation of the game and slowly, piece by piece, bit by bit, thinking about and furnishing out the details. So we started in part 2 thinking about the classes, game and player, and we ended up with this kind of overall implementation where we've got two players taking turns um, and a game of 3 stages setting up a main loop taking turns, and this involved the players doing the shooting action by calling the shoot method, and of course there is a third stage to report the results of the game. So at this point it makes sense to move and think about doing the same exercise, a similar exercise in the other classes, right? Thinking about the details of the other classes we've got here, board, sail, and ship, and try to see if we can connect them to game and player at this point, okay? So the connection is basically here because the player has two boards, right? His own board and the enemy's board, right? And in the setting up stage, if you take a look at the reference run in here, you can see that the human player is supposed to place the ships, and this information is entered to the program via the keyboard. But it's also the case that the computer player will also choose their own pieces placement. Of course, you don't see it because this is a program, so it's doing the choice automatically without you seeing that. But that implies that a player has a way to select or to place ships or to initiate the board at some point in time. So if you take a look here, again, this is something we haven't thought about when we read the description, but again, those details come along step by step. It seems that we need a method to initiate the board. So I'm going to create a method called initiate board or init board, right? And I'm going to do the same here, is initiating the board, or the board maybe, just as kind of a marker for me to see what's going on when I run the code. Of course, before shipping this program, I will need to turn off all of these unnecessary print line statements. Okay, so that's fine, and we can go to game here and think about where that falls here, right? So you're setting the name, and then you want player 1 to initiate their board, and you want player 2 to initiate their board here. So of course you do this, and you can see that it's asking for input, called AI. Whoops, sorry, infinite loop. Didn't even have a chance to see what's going on, but okay. So let's do it one more time. So you can see that the first player would initiate the board, the second player will initiate the board, and then that's before the main loop. So now that the two players in initiating their board, let's take a look back at the sample run and see what's involved at this point. Well, it seems that there is another step, which is printing the two boards for us to see, right? And that's basically deliverable 1. So once the user chooses their own pieces and the computer player chooses their own pieces as well, you need to print the two boards. So if you go to game, after initiating the board, you basically want to print this board, this board um, to the user to see, right? And of course, we're printing the enemy's board. We shouldn't do this because it's a game. I'm just doing this to make it easier to test and see what's inside. So this is yet another method we haven't thought about, which is printing board, right? So let's go ahead and implement that method in the class player before going back to main. So I'm going to create a method called print board to print basically the board, right? Now it seems that since we have two boards, it makes sense to provide a way to print the enemy's board, right? Because at some point you want to show the player's board and also the player's knowledge of the enemy's board, at least for the human player. So I'm going to create two methods actually. I'm going to create onBoard and also print enemy's board. Well, for now, for the main method, we just need to call print onBoard, and we need to call the same method for player 2 to print their own board. Okay, so again, we can provide something here like is printing onBoard is printing enemy's board. So if you go back to main and you try to run, you can see the sequence of steps: initiating, printing the board, and then the main loop, shooting and so on and so forth. Okay, so now at this point, let's think about printing the board. Excuse me. So in player, print the board. How do we print the board? Well, so to print the board, since this is a class, it makes sense to delegate this action to board itself. Because from the player perspective, we shouldn't be really concerned about the details of how to print the board. We've got a class called board. It's supposed to provide such a function for us. Very similar when you call nextInt from scanner, you don't really know, you don't want to know about reading input from the keyboard. This is the job of scanner. You call nextInt, scanner is supposed to do, or next line, to know how to fetch that input to you. So I'm going to follow the same kind of logic in here, setting that from the perspective of me as a player. I don't care. I want to say my board, which is onBoard, go ahead and print yourself. And the same story here, enemy's board, go ahead and print yourself. Okay. All right, so of course that method does not exist, hence that error here, because that method does not exist in board. But we can go to board and we can create a method called print. Since it's printing, it's void, it doesn't return anything. So what we need to do is basically just to provide the stub board is printing. Now we go back to player. There's only one last step we need to do, which is basically to initialize those two variables because they're nulls. If you try to run the code as is right now, you'll get a null pointer exception because those two attributes are nulls. Right, when you call print on onBoard is initially null. You can't do that. You need to create that object. All right. Again, when you call new, this is where the object is created. This is essential. Otherwise, you can't call on methods on it. So that's the basic here. If I run it, you can see that, well, I'm printing player 1 printing the board. You can see board is printing and AI is printing their board. Board is printing. This is basically the result of calling the method printing here. Okay, so that's a good first step, but of course we want to print what's inside the board. So now this gives us the chance to think about what's inside the class board. This one should be a bit familiar to us because we've created that tic-tac-toe game with two-dimensional array of cells, right? So if you want to print what's inside the board, you probably need a nested loop, right, to go inside cells and print its content. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to initialize this to be a new array, and the size of that array I think is 15 by 10, right? Again, that's the specification of the problem. It's 15 by 10. So I need 15 by 10. And those are 15 columns and 10 rows. So I'm going to do 10, 15. I like to use the conventions that the first dimension is the row and the second one is the column. It doesn't make a difference if you do 15, 10 as long as you do the indexing properly. So of course I don't like those magic numbers, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to make those constant variables here. So I'm going to do rows are 10, and of course the convention is to use uppercase, right? And final int columns are 15. Make this private. For a final variable, it doesn't really matter if you make it private or not, because its value will be constant, so no one can change it. I can keep it as non-private in this particular situation because it's a constant. Rows, columns. Okay, so that's it. Let's make this happen. Remember that double nested loop for int r from 0 to I is less than cells. Well, actually we've got a constant here, so why don't we use it? It's r, it's not I. And then inside this we do int columns. C is less than columns. Oh, it's late at night, so what I'm going to do, I'm basically going to print the content of that and system out print the content of cells at row and column, which should be initially empty. And I can put like a separator here to separate this cell from the adjacent cell. It boils down to how you want to format it. I did not put like columns here, but you can do that if you want to see initially what's going on. Now, of course, once you're done, you need to do that system out print line. And actually, I'm going to put an empty line, and I'm going to put like before starting the line, just one empty row here to see what's going on. Empty, like a vertical character to begin that row, right? And then prints the cells. So if I do this, I provide the implementation of print. When I print, I should see those two boards printing out properly here. Okay, so we've got 10 rows with 15 columns, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and those should be 15. I'm not going to count, but that should be the case. Of course, this is not complete because you're supposed to provide some headers, right? A header row and a column index to guide the player, right? This is a detail that can be finished out later on. So of course, finish or clean the printing, header row and column and this is needed. So just add another to-do item on my to-do list for the future. Okay. All right, so that's kind of progressing. It's looking good so far. So we know now how to print the board, right? I would like this board to have some initial value for me to see what's inside it. Right now they're all empty characters, right? But in the future they will not be empty. So I think at this point it helps to think about what you're putting inside this board, the array. So it's an array of characters. How many characters do we need in this particular game? So an easy way to do it is just to look at the sample run and see what are the different values for these cells. So you get the water, which basically means it's an open sea, right? You've got the square, which means it's my own ship, which is still safe. You've got this 8 billiard ball, which means it's a miss, that the enemy tried to target me, but it was a miss. And I tried to target the enemies and it was a miss. And of course you've got the hit. It can be in both cases that the enemy targeted me and it was a hit, and I targeted the enemy and it was a hit. So if you count these, there is 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And you can think conceptually about the game, but you've got basically 4 values. One of them for unknown, which is basically the open sea. The other one for a ship, which is the square. The other one for a miss, and the last one is for a hit. Okay, so that's basically those values here. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to encode these values inside my program. I'm going to see, because this is now a character, so it can be any character in the world, and I want to limit this. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create, I'm going to limit my choice by creating some final variables. So I'm going to create a final char, call it C, and let's be S. Now the code that I provided to you, this code which showed up properly on Mac but not on Windows, used Unicode characters. And Unicode characters, not only you can store alphabet characters, but you can store also many of the special characters, including emojis. So, and that's basically what I did. I stored some of these characters, and those characters should render well. So since it's St. Patrick, so why don't we store a shamrock here? You can basically take this one and copy it and paste it here instead of your character S. Not all of them are working fine, and I'm not sure where is this error is coming from. Some of them work well if you paste them as a character, but not all of them. So to avoid this issue and the situation that it's working on some platform, is not working, I decided to use regular characters. So they don't look as neat as those Unicode characters, but they're guaranteed to work on both Mac and Windows platforms. So that's one for C, and I'm going to get one for ship P, final char hit, going to make it an X, and final char miss, I'm going to make it an O in this case. I mean, of course, you can play with different values. I think I used the tilde and the S for in the example I posted on ELC. So let's do the same, right? So those are some of the values here, and what I'm going to do here, just for the sake of kind of experimenting and see if it prints well, I'm going to create a method called randomize. And of course, in a real game, you don't want to randomize your board, but it makes sense in a testing phase that you want to give it some initial values to see something printed out. So basically in randomize, I'm going to create a random board. So I'm going to take out this double nested loop here, but instead of printing, I'm going to assign values to those tests, the cells in the board. So what I'm going to do cells RC, and I'm going to think about assigning a value for it. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to assume that it's initially OpenC, but then I'm going to throw a random number and see if it's 0, 1, 2, 3, if I want to change this from C to be S, X, O. Okay, so I can do it in multiple ways. I can actually throw a random number between 0 and 3, just 4 values, and see what we get. So I'm going to create a random number generator, for instance, here. So I need to import that from UTIL, of course. So in this situation here, I'm going to create a random, an instance of random, and I'm going in each iteration here, call on next int, v random next int, and I want to bound it by 4, right? Because I've got 4 values, so it will be 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2, 3. So what I'm going to do in this situation, I'm going to do switch or if, or conditional expression. Let's do it with a conditional expression. It's much more concise. So cells v is equals 0. If this is the case, then it's C. Otherwise, if v equals 1, then it's ship. Otherwise, if v equals 2, then it's a hit. Otherwise, if it's not 0, 1, 2, it will be 3 for sure, so it will be miss. So basically, I randomize the board here. We're just kind of throwing random values here. So I can either use it here inside board, right? Or instead I can go to player and say, well, so the player is supposed to initiate the board, and initiating the board will depend on whether the player is a human or not, and it will take some input. What I'm going to do, I'm going to randomize it for now. So I'm going to do onboard randomize. Okay, so of course to do on my to-do list is to kind of fix this one, right? Fix this. But for now, let's start with a random value. And if you do this, you will see that you should see that each one of the players is starting with a random board. Of course, those 2 random boards already include hit and misses, so they don't make sense, of course. But the idea is that you see that the board is a combination of cells of these different values. Okay. So next, we will think about initiating the board. I'm going to stop at this point, and what's important in here to think about ship and how ship falls into kind of the overall equation in here. And ship will play a role when you're initiating your board, right? Because you don't initiate your board randomly. Basically, you initiate your board by placing those ships on the board, right? So the the S's have to follow a certain pattern. They have to be valid patterns based on the ships. Okay, so I'm going to stop at this point and we will continue later on.